Far away, a great stone door closes, and its echo lingers beneath the mountains long after the hands that sealed it are gone. Welcome, dear traveler. I am the Watcher, and I have kept silent company with the long years of Middle-earth. Some secrets sleep beneath root and rock, waiting not for the boldest, but for the patient. Come now, walk softly with me, and listen to a tale that time itself almost forgot. The years of war had passed into memory, yet the mountains endured, as they always had, ancient beyond the reckoning of kings, and untouched by the rise and fall of kingdoms. Beneath the green slopes that overlooked Helm's Deep, the glittering caves rang with the steady music of hammer upon chisel. Lamps gleamed like captured stars against polished walls, where crystal veins caught every flicker of flame and scattered it into 1,000 dancing lights. The deep halls breathed with the warmth of living stone, and the scent of fresh-cut rock mingled with forge smoke that drifted lazily through broad chambers. Here, Gimli, son of Glóin, had fulfilled the promise he once spoke beside the Hornburg, and every passing year brought new beauty to caverns that many had overlooked until a dwarf's eyes revealed their splendor. The labor of the dwarves began before sunrise and seldom ceased before darkness covered the white mountains. Great blocks of marble moved across polished floors, while younger craftsmen learned the patient art of shaping stone without haste or waste. Songs older than Gondor echoed through the halls, rising and falling with every measured stroke of iron tools. Gimli walked among his folk without ceremony, stopping often to test the edge of a carving or offer a quiet word to an apprentice whose hands still lacked confidence. He had worn mail against orcs and stood before the Black Gate, yet he found equal satisfaction in seeing a perfect arch completed by honest work. Peace, he had discovered, demanded strength no less than war. One autumn morning, a messenger arrived from the northern galleries carrying a leather satchel covered with pale dust. His beard was streaked with gray despite his modest years, and the weariness in his face suggested he had climbed many steep passages without pause. Bowing respectfully, he placed several weathered fragments of stone upon a broad table before Gimli. These were uncovered beyond the eastern workings, he said. They were hidden behind a wall that seemed newer than the rock surrounding it, though no dwarf here remembers raising such a barrier. Gimli lifted one fragment into his calloused hands and slowly brushed away the dust with his thumb, revealing faint runes, unlike those carved by his own people in recent ages. The dwarf lord studied the markings in silence, while the workshop around him continued its steady rhythm. Time had softened the edges of the runes, yet they retained a precision that spoke of master craftsmen from centuries long vanished. Between the familiar angular characters lay delicate lines resembling leaves woven into the design, a pattern unlike any ordinary dwarven ornament. Gimli frowned, turning the fragment toward the light as crystals overhead reflected pale glimmers across its surface. Whoever carved this, he murmured, worked with both pride and uncommon patience. These signs are older than the kingdom beneath Erebor, perhaps older still. The discovery stirred quiet excitement throughout the glittering caves before the day was over. Veterans who had journeyed with Gimli through the years gathered around the fragments, offering guesses that ranged from forgotten mines to abandoned treasure vaults. Younger dwarves whispered eagerly of lost armories hidden deep beneath the White Mountains, imagining halls untouched since the elder days. Gimli listened without encouraging their hopes, for experience had taught him that legends often concealed disappointment beneath attractive tales. Even so, he could not ignore the strange mixture of dwarven craft and graceful designs that seemed almost foreign to the stone. Something hidden lay beyond the sealed passage, and whoever had closed it had done so with deliberate care. That evening, Gimli carried the fragments alone into a quiet chamber overlooking one of the largest crystal caverns. Water flowed softly through channels carved generations earlier, and the sound steadied his thoughts while he examined every mark beneath the glow of a single lantern. Memories returned unbidden of Rivendell, of ancient halls where elven carvings had seemed to grow from living wood rather than shaped timber. He remembered, too, the friendship that had begun against all expectation with Legolas Greenleaf, a bond that many in Middle-earth would once have considered impossible. The leaf-shaped lines upon the stone refused to leave his thoughts. They reminded him less of decoration than of a deliberate signature left by hands that valued beauty as much as endurance. At dawn, he ordered a careful inspection of the newly discovered corridor. No eager picks would be allowed to shatter whatever history lay hidden beyond the ancient wall. The miners obeyed willingly, clearing rubble with brushes, wedges, and narrow chisels instead of heavy hammers. Before long, they uncovered the outline of a concealed doorway whose edges had been sealed so skillfully that centuries of dust had almost erased every trace. The stone itself appeared untouched by cracks, despite the weight of the mountain pressing upon it. Gimli rested one hand against the cold surface and felt an unexpected stillness, as though the silence behind it had endured through countless generations. When the final layer of rubble was removed, the doorway revealed no lock, no handle, and no visible means of opening it. Instead, a narrow band of carved symbols circled its frame from floor to ceiling. Some belonged unmistakably to Khuzdul, though their style had long fallen from common use, while others resembled graceful flowing letters that no dwarf would ever have invented. One of the oldest stonemasons adjusted his spectacles and shook his head in puzzlement. "These are not warnings," he said slowly, "nor are they boasts. It is as though two different hands sought to leave one message together." Gimli's brows drew together, for such a thing was nearly unheard of in the long and troubled history between elves and dwarves. He gave orders that no one should attempt to force the door before its mystery was understood. A few of the younger warriors protested, believing that stout axes could answer questions more swiftly than patient study. Gimli silenced them with little more than a glance. "Stone remembers every careless blow," he said firmly. "If our fathers sealed this place for a reason, we shall honor their craft until we know that reason ourselves." None argued further, for those who knew him understood that stubbornness in Gimli was matched only by caution through bitter experience. That night, the wind swept across the Deepingcoombe, carrying the scent of approaching rain through the mountain passes. Gimli climbed alone to the entrance of the glittering caves and gazed westward, where the fading light painted the peaks in shades of bronze and crimson. Somewhere beyond forests, rivers, and countless leagues lay Ithilien, where Legolas had made fair lands bloom again beneath the rule of King Elisar. A faint smile touched the dwarf's face, despite the growing chill. "If ever there was a puzzle that would delight that woodland prince," he muttered, "it is one that bears both leaf and stone." Before the stars had reached their highest course, a raven departed from Helm's Deep, carrying a carefully written message bound beneath one dark wing. It flew eastward above the sleeping plains of Rohan, rising over rivers silvered by moonlight, and vanishing into the vastness beyond the mountains. Gimli watched until the bird disappeared from sight, trusting that old friendships remained as steadfast in peace as they had been in war. He could not know what awaited beyond the sealed door, yet he felt the quiet certainty that the answer would not belong to dwarves alone. Whatever secret had rested beneath the White Mountains since forgotten ages had begun to stir, and before many days had passed, the road of adventure would once more call both son of Glóin and prince of the woodland realm together. Legolas received the raven beneath the green boughs of Ithilien, while the morning mist still lingered above the streams. The years had softened nothing of his keen sight, and before the bird settled upon a stone rail, he had already guessed the hand that had written the message. Around him, young trees, planted after the Great War, had grown tall enough to cast broad shadows across the woodland paths, and birdsong drifted through leaves that had reclaimed places once scarred by fire and marching armies. He untied the narrow strip of parchment with gentle fingers and read it only once before folding it carefully. A quiet smile touched his face, for Gimli rarely sought counsel unless stone itself had begun to whisper secrets. Within the hour, he had spoken with the wardens who watched over Ithilien in the name of King Elessar. They offered horses, escorts, and supplies for a long road, but Legolas accepted only what was necessary. He had crossed Middle-earth through darker days with less, and the lands between Ithilien and Helm's Deep had grown safer since the Shadow's fall. As he fastened his quiver across his shoulder, one of the younger wardens asked whether danger had returned to the White Mountains. Legolas shook his head thoughtfully before replying. Danger often walks beside forgotten things, though neither announces its coming. My friend has found something that troubles even a dwarf's certainty, and that alone is reason enough for haste. The journey westward carried him across familiar roads, where memories rose with every league. He passed through villages rebuilt after the war, where children who had never known the terror of orcs laughed beside fields heavy with grain. Shepherds saluted the elf with quiet respect, though few recognized the companion who had once ridden with the Fellowship of the Ring. At evening, he paused upon a wooded ridge and looked toward the distant White Mountains, their peaks gleaming beneath the last light of the sinking sun. The sight stirred recollections of darker marches, yet now smoke rose peacefully from scattered homes instead of burning fortresses, and the silence belonged to contented folk rather than hidden enemies. 3 days later, the towers of Helm's Deep stood before him, their ancient stone no longer bearing the wounds of desperate battle. Dwarven banners fluttered near the entrance to the glittering caves, and the steady rhythm of hammers echoed faintly through the valley. Before Legolas had reached the gate, Gimli himself emerged to greet him with broad steps and an expression that mixed welcome with impatience. "You have taken your time," the dwarf declared, though his eyes shone warmly beneath heavy brows. Legolas laughed softly and clasped his friend's forearm. "You summoned me across half a kingdom, and still I arrived before your mystery found its answer." Together they descended into the glittering caves, whose beauty had only deepened since Legolas had first beheld them after the Battle of Helm's Deep. Even now, the elf slowed more than once to admire crystal pillars that glowed like frozen waterfalls beneath hidden lamps. The walls reflected colors too subtle for most eyes to notice, shifting from pale blue to warm gold as they walked deeper into the mountain. Gimli observed his companion with quiet satisfaction. Long ago, he would have expected an elf to praise forests alone, but years had taught Legolas to see splendor wherever honest craft honored the world. "You have improved these halls again," the elf said at last. "Your people shaped the mountain without robbing it of its own voice." Gimli led him to the chamber where the carved fragments rested upon a broad stone table. Without speaking, he handed one piece into Legolas's waiting hands and watched closely as the elf examined its surface. At first there was only silence, broken by the distant ringing of chisels somewhere beyond the chamber. Then Legolas drew a slow breath, turning the fragment toward the lamplight, exactly as Gimli himself had done days before. "These leaves," he murmured, "they are not merely ornament. I have seen their likeness once before, though not since my father's halls preserved records from ages beyond memory." The words settled heavily between them, Gimli folded his arms and leaned forward. "Then they are truly elvish?" he asked. Legolas nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. "Not in the fashion of Rivendell or Lorien," he answered. "Their form is far older. Whoever carved these patterns belonged to a people whose works were already ancient when my grandfather walked beneath Greenwood's boughs. I never expected to find such signs buried beneath these mountains." Without delay, they made their way to the hidden doorway, accompanied only by 2 trusted dwarven elders bearing lanterns. The corridor beyond the regular workings felt strangely untouched, its air cool and perfectly still, despite the labor nearby. Dust rested upon every ledge, as though no living creature had disturbed it for centuries. When Legolas reached the sealed entrance, he stopped without a word. Dot. His hand drifted lightly across the carved frame, following the flowing lines, while his eyes traced symbols, nearly erased by time. "This place was made by more than one people," he said quietly. "No single craftsman could have joined these designs so completely." One of the elders lifted his lantern closer, allowing the fading carvings to emerge more clearly from the stone. Legolas studied them for several long moments before speaking again. "These letters are incomplete, because part of the outer ring has worn away. Yet enough remains to read their purpose." Gimli stepped beside him, waiting without interruption. The elf spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "Let neither pride nor fear divide those who enter. That is the beginning. The rest has been lost to time." The dwarves exchanged puzzled glances. Such words sounded less like a warning than an invitation, yet they explained nothing about what lay beyond the sealed passage. Gimli rested both hands upon the stone and frowned. If elves and dwarves truly built this together, then it must have been in an age unlike any we remember. Legolas inclined his head. There were such times, though they were few and often forgotten after grief followed. History preserves the great wars more faithfully than the quiet seasons when old enemies learned to trust. As they searched the surrounding walls, one of the younger craftsmen called from farther down the passage. His voice echoed sharply enough to bring everyone at once. Set low beside the floor, almost hidden beneath centuries of dust, lay a narrow groove cut with astonishing precision into the rock. It curved gently away from the doorway before vanishing beneath loose stones deeper within the tunnel. Gimli knelt beside it, brushing away grit with his thick fingers. The channel was smooth as polished glass, yet completely dry. Legolas crouched beside him and touched the edge with the tip of one finger. A faint fragrance rose from the ancient stone, so delicate that even the dwarves noticed it only after he drew their attention. It was not the scent of damp earth or old minerals, but something living, like spring blossoms carried upon a distant breeze. Gimli inhaled again, disbelief spreading across his face. "Flowers," he muttered. "Beneath solid mountain?" Legolas did not answer immediately. Instead, he gazed into the darkness, where the narrow groove disappeared, and said in a voice scarcely louder than a whisper, "Not merely flowers. I believe something once grew here, and if any trace of it still survives, then we stand at the edge of a tale that even the oldest songs have forgotten." The silence that followed seemed deeper than the mountain itself. None present spoke while their lanterns cast trembling light into the untouched passage beyond the hidden door. Somewhere in that forgotten darkness, sealed away through uncounted generations, waited the answer to a mystery that neither dwarf nor elf had expected to find. And before another sunrise, they would begin searching for the means to open a doorway that time itself had guarded for thousands of years. Morning came without warmth beneath the white mountains. Even when the sun climbed above the eastern ridges, its light reached only the entrance of the hidden passage before surrendering to the patient darkness below. Gimli had ordered the ordinary work within the glittering caves to continue, for he would not have every hammer abandoned in pursuit of a mystery. Yet the chosen company gathered quietly around the sealed doorway, carrying lanterns, ropes, chisels, and provisions, enough for several days beneath the earth. Every face showed the same restrained curiosity, though none dared speak loudly in the presence of stone that had lain undisturbed since forgotten ages. Legolas returned to the doorway before the others approached and examined the carved frame once again. His fingers lingered upon the weathered letters, while his keen eyes followed every curve where dwarf work met elven design. Several places bore tiny marks that could easily have been mistaken for natural cracks, yet their spacing was too deliberate to belong to chance. Gimli watched him patiently before stepping beside him. "You see something new," he said. Legolas nodded without looking away from the stone. "Not new," he replied, "merely overlooked. Whoever shaped this entrance wished it to remain hidden, but not forever." "Bottom." The elf knelt and traced the narrow groove they had discovered the day before until it vanished beneath loose rubble several paces away. Together, they carefully lifted the fallen stones instead of striking them apart. Beneath the debris lay the continuation of the smooth channel, still perfectly preserved despite the passing centuries. It curved gently toward the right side of the doorway before ending beneath a square slab fitted so precisely into the floor that even dwarven eyes had failed to notice it at first glance. Gimli ran his palm across the edges and smiled faintly. "That," he murmured, "is the work of a master." With iron hooks and steady hands, the dwarves raised the slab only a finger's breadth before stopping at Gimli's command. No hidden dart sprang forth. No ancient mechanism groaned awake. They lifted it higher until a shallow basin appeared beneath, carved from a single piece of pale stone, unlike the darker rock surrounding it. Dust filled the hollow almost to its rim, but after careful brushing, a design emerged upon its base. It showed a single flower with 6 slender petals, surrounded by leaves unlike any plant that grew in the valleys of Rohan. One of the older dwarves frowned deeply. "There is no fitting for a key," he observed, "nor any place for a lever." Legolas leaned over the basin and studied the flower in silence before looking toward the narrow groove leading into it. "Perhaps no iron key was ever intended," he said quietly. Gimli folded his arms, thinking. The groove, the basin, and the sealed door formed one design, though their purpose remained hidden. "Then what opens it?" he asked. Legolas smiled only slightly. "Something that flows." Fresh water was fetched from one of the clear springs within the glittering caves. The dwarves poured it slowly into the basin, while every eye remained fixed upon the ancient carving. At first, nothing happened. The water settled over the flower and reflected the lantern light with perfect stillness. Then, almost too faintly to hear, a soft click echoed somewhere inside the mountain. The narrow groove darkened as water slipped through unseen channels beneath the stone, vanishing into the hidden workings beyond the doorway. A low rumble followed, not violent, but deep enough to vibrate through the soles of their boots. Dust drifted gently from the ceiling, while ancient gears awakened after an age of silence. The sealed doorway trembled once before drawing backward into the mountain by the width of a hand. More hidden weights shifted within unseen chambers, each movement deliberate and measured. Slowly, the great slab slid aside without the aid of any living hand. A breath of cool air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying with it the unmistakable fragrance of blossoms after spring rain. No one spoke for several moments. Even the dwarves, who trusted stone above all things, seemed reluctant to cross the threshold. Gimli lifted his lantern and stepped forward first, though Legolas remained close beside him. Beyond the doorway stretched a broad passage untouched by collapse or flood. The floor had been swept smooth by craftsmen whose care defied the centuries, and neither cobweb nor scattered rubble disturbed its remarkable order. It seemed less like a forgotten mine than a hall awaiting the return of those who had only recently departed. The walls soon revealed carvings unlike any either race had seen together. Dwarven pillars supported the ceiling with solid strength, yet between them climbed graceful branches sculpted from the same living rock. Birds perched among stone leaves, whose edges were as delicate as carved ivory, while clusters of flowers emerged from the trunks with astonishing realism. Gimli stopped repeatedly despite himself, reaching out to examine the joins between the different styles. No mason could imitate another people so perfectly, he said. Legolas answered with quiet certainty. Because no one imitated. They worked side by side. Their footsteps echoed through the corridor until they reached a circular chamber at its end. There the passage widened into a hall crowned by a domed ceiling where tiny crystals glittered like stars against the darkness. In the center stood a dry fountain carved from pale marble, its basin empty but untouched by decay. Around it rested 12 stone seats, arranged in equal measure, 6 bearing dwarven designs, and 6 adorned with flowing leaves. None was raised above the others. Gimli slowly removed his helmet without quite knowing why. Upon the far wall stood a single pillar unlike the rest. Instead of carvings, its polished face held an inscription divided into 2 columns. One was written in ancient Khuzdal, beyond the learning of every dwarf present, except for scattered words preserved in old songs. The other flowed in an elder form of Elvish that even Legolas read only with careful effort. Together, they pieced the opening lines into the common tongue. Here shall endure the covenant of stone and green life until shadow passes from the mountains. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that filled the silent hall. As Legolas continued reading, his expression slowly changed from curiosity to astonishment. He paused twice before speaking aloud again, as though doubting his own understanding. Gimli waited without interruption, sensing that the meaning mattered more than speed. At last, the elf turned toward his friend. "This was no refuge," he said softly. "It was a place of keeping. Something living was entrusted to both peoples, and neither was meant to guard it alone." Before anyone could answer, one of the dwarves called out from a narrow doorway beyond the fountain. His lantern revealed another corridor, descending deeper beneath the mountain. Along its center ran the same smooth channel that had carried water through the hidden mechanism, but now a faint trickle still flowed along its polished bed. The sweet fragrance that had greeted them at the entrance drifted upward more strongly than before, fresh and unmistakable despite the countless years below the earth. Gimli and Legolas exchanged a silent glance. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, beyond passages sealed since the Elder Days, something alive was still waiting. The narrow corridor descended with such gentle precision that no traveler noticed the slope until the air itself began to change. It grew cooler with every 100 paces, yet the fragrance that drifted along the ancient watercourse became richer instead of fading. Gimli walked at the front beside Legolas, his lantern casting warm circles of light over walls that had escaped even the smallest crack. Behind them came 4 trusted dwarves, each chosen for steady hands rather than eager tempers. None spoke above a whisper, for the stillness of the hidden hall seemed worthy of respect, as though careless voices might awaken echoes better left asleep. The passage bent gradually until the light revealed another marvel of forgotten craftsmanship. A clear stream flowed from the living rock through a channel scarcely wider than a man's hand, crossing the corridor beneath a graceful stone bridge, no taller than Gimli's knee-moss. pale as emerald silk, clung to the edges where the water passed, though no sunlight had reached that place for uncounted centuries. Legolas knelt beside the stream and dipped 2 fingers into its current. "Cold as snow melt," he said quietly, lifting his hand to catch the scent. "Yet there is no bitterness in it. Whatever nourishes these halls has remained pure beyond all expectation." Gimli crouched beside him, studying the channel more carefully. The stone bore no stains left by long neglect, and the flowing water remained perfectly clear, despite its age-old course through the mountain. "Someone intended this stream to endure," he observed, "not merely for drinking, but for tending something." One of the older dwarves pointed farther ahead, where the channel divided into several smaller branches before vanishing beneath carved thresholds. The careful arrangement reminded Gimli less of a mine than of irrigation works built to sustain living ground. The realization settled uneasily upon him, for dwarves seldom shaped mountains with gardens in mind. Beyond the bridge, they entered a broad gallery lined with carved alcoves. At first, the recesses appeared empty, but as the company drew nearer, each revealed shallow stone shelves supporting cracked clay vessels. Most had long since broken beneath the slow work of time, leaving only scattered fragments across the polished floor. Legolas lifted one surviving vessel with extraordinary care, turning it slowly beneath the lantern light. Faded upon its side remained the painted image of the same 6-petaled flower they had seen carved into the basin that opened the hidden door. The colors had nearly vanished, yet traces of white petals and silver-green leaves still clung stubbornly to the ancient clay. One of the younger dwarves frowned in puzzlement. "Seeds?" he asked, peering into a shattered pot. Gimli examined the powder that remained inside before rubbing it gently between thumb and forefinger. Dot. It crumbled into fine dust without the slightest trace of life. "Whatever rested here returned to the earth long ago," he said. Legolas continued studying the painted flower. "Or perhaps these vessels carried something from another place. They were not made to display beauty alone. They were meant to preserve it." The gallery ended before a pair of slender stone doors standing partly open. Unlike the great entrance behind them, these doors bore no hidden mechanism, and they yielded silently beneath Gimli's hand. A chamber beyond spread wider than any they had yet discovered, its ceiling upheld by columns carved into the likeness of towering trees whose branches intertwined high overhead. Between the pillars stretched broad beds of dark soil bordered with smooth white stone. Though barren now, their careful arrangement left little doubt about their former purpose. The hidden refuge had sheltered not treasure, but a garden. Silence settled over the company as they walked among the empty beds. The soil remained strangely soft beneath their boots, despite the passing ages, and thin roots, pale as old ivory, still threaded through the earth, where living plants had once flourished. Channels carried fresh water neatly around every bed before returning to the central stream. Gimli knelt, scooping a handful of the dark earth into his palm. It smelled clean and fertile, untouched by rot or decay. "No dwarf built this for ornament," he said. "It was tended with the same care we give our finest forges." Legolas wandered slowly between the ancient plots, his sharp eyes searching every corner. Suddenly he stopped beside one bed near the far wall and lowered himself to one knee. Gimli crossed the chamber at once, finding the elf gazing not at the soil, but at a cluster of tiny green shoots no taller than a finger. They were so delicate that the lantern's warmth made them tremble. Fresh leaves unfolded upon slender stems, impossibly alive after thousands of years, hidden beneath the mountain. "By Durin," whispered one of the dwarves, "something still grows." Legolas touched neither leaf nor stem. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as though greeting an old friend. "These are not the flower," he said after a long silence. "Only its companions. I know them from the oldest gardens of the elves. They were often planted nearby because they shared the same waters." Gimli looked around the vast chamber with renewed wonder. If humble plants had survived, perhaps the greater treasure spoken of upon the pillar had endured as well. Hope stirred within him, tempered immediately by caution. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts. It came not from ahead, but from somewhere behind them, distant yet unmistakable. Stone scraped softly against stone, followed by the brief clatter of something falling. Every dwarf reached instinctively for axe or hammer, while Legolas's bow was already in his hand before the echo faded. They waited without moving, listening into the silence that returned as suddenly as it had broken. No second sound followed. Gimli extinguished one lantern with a swift motion, leaving the chamber lit only by the others. Shadows gathered among the carved columns, and every passage leading back toward the hidden entrance seemed deeper than before. "We are not alone," he said in a voice scarcely above a breath. One dwarf volunteered to return immediately and inspect the upper halls, but Gimli shook his head. "Not alone," he repeated. "If someone entered after us, dividing our strength is exactly what they would hope for." Legolas moved soundlessly toward the doorway through which they had entered, pausing only long enough to study the dust upon the polished floor. When he returned, his expression had grown grave. "Fresh prints," he said. "Not ours." Gimli crouched beside the marks and measured them with experienced eyes. Dot. The impressions were narrow, made by rough boots rather than dwarven shoes, and several edges remained sharp enough to show they had been left only moments before. Whoever had followed them possessed enough discipline to move quietly through unfamiliar halls. The company withdrew from the center of the garden and took shelter among the broad stone columns overlooking the entrance. The hidden refuge that moments earlier had seemed untouched by the passage of ages now felt suddenly vulnerable. Somewhere within those forgotten corridors, unseen feet moved through darkness toward the same secret they had uncovered. And deep beneath the mountain, where living green still defied the weight of endless stone, the first contest for the ancient keeping had quietly begun. No one moved until the silence settled once more over the hidden garden. The dwarves held their lanterns low, shielding the light behind the broad stone trunks carved into the likeness of ancient trees. Gimli listened with the patience learned through years beneath the mountains, where a single careless footstep could reveal more than shouted words. Legolas remained perfectly still beside the entrance, his bow already strung, his eyes fixed upon the darkness beyond. Somewhere in the winding passages, a pebble shifted, followed by the faint scrape of leather against stone, and both friends understood that whoever had entered the refuge was advancing with caution rather than haste. The strangers appeared gradually from the corridor, their lantern carefully hooded until only a narrow beam escaped. They were men, not orcs, wrapped in worn cloaks stained by long travel through mountain paths. Their swords showed little ornament, but every blade had seen honest use, and their faces bore the hard expression of those who lived by uncertain fortune. One among them carried a rolled parchment bound inside a weathered leather case, glancing often between the faded map and the passages ahead. Their leader whispered, "The old writing spoke true. Keep searching. The treasure cannot be far." Gimli waited until all 6 men had entered the chamber before stepping from behind the nearest pillar. His mail gave a brief metallic whisper as the lantern light caught the polished edge of his axe. "You have wandered farther than wisdom permits," he said calmly, his voice echoing across the empty garden. Every stranger spun at once, weapons half drawn. while Legolas emerged soundlessly from the opposite side, his arrow resting upon the bowstring without yet being aimed. The leader's eyes darted between elf and dwarf before settling uneasily upon Gimli. "We seek no quarrel," he replied, though his hand remained upon his sword hilt. "We only claim what has lain abandoned." "Abandoned?" Gimli answered, taking another deliberate step forward. "These halls were hidden, not forsaken. There is a difference, and you would do well to remember it." The leader hesitated, studying the dwarf's face as though hoping to find uncertainty there. Instead, he found only the calm resolve that had stood before the black gate itself. One of the younger men muttered that they should leave while they still could, but another shook his head impatiently. "We've crossed half the White Mountains for this place," he whispered. "There must be gold somewhere beyond." Legolas lowered his bow a fraction, sensing confusion more than malice among the intruders. "Who gave you this map?" he asked. The leader slowly removed the worn parchment from its case and unfolded it with careful hands. Time had darkened the skin upon which it had been drawn, and several corners had nearly crumbled away. Across its surface ran crude sketches of tunnels, marked with notes written in an old form of the common speech. "It belonged to my grandfather," the man answered. "He bought it from a trader in Gondor, who claimed it had once come from a ruined fortress in the mountains. Every owner believed it marked the road to a forgotten dwarven horde." Gimli extended one broad hand. "Let me see it." After a brief pause, the man surrendered the map. Gimli examined it beside the lantern, while Legolas leaned close enough to study the faded ink. Much had been copied poorly from an older source, yet one detail caught the elf's eye immediately. In the margin appeared the familiar six-petaled flower, though whoever had reproduced it had mistaken the blossom for a strange star. Beneath it, nearly erased by time, survived a single line written in an ancient elvish hand. Legolas translated it softly. "The bloom endures where greed cannot see." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Several of the strangers exchanged uncertain glances, and even their leader frowned as though the promise of hidden riches had suddenly grown less certain. Gimli folded the map and handed it back without anger. "You were deceived by generations who copied only what they wished to believe," he said. "This place was never built to hide gold." The leader's shoulders sagged with visible disappointment, yet stubborn hope still lingered in his eyes. "Then what lies deeper within these halls?" Manobal. Before either Gimli or Legolas could answer, a harsh cry echoed from somewhere far below the garden. It rose through the hidden corridors, rough and guttural, unlike the voices of men. Every face hardened at once. Another cry answered the first, then another, until the sounds merged into the unmistakable clamor of orcs speaking among themselves. Gimli's grip tightened around his axe. "So," he said quietly, "we were not the only ones followed." The leader of the treasure seekers went pale. "That cannot be," he whispered. "We saw no one upon the mountain." Legolas had already crossed to the descending passage, listening with his head slightly inclined. "You saw no one because they remained beneath the rocks," he answered. "Small bands still wander forgotten tunnels in these mountains. They have survived by avoiding open lands since the fall of Sauron." Gimli joined him, and together they listened as the distant voices grew steadily louder. The orcs had found the hidden entrance. The company wasted no time. Gimli ordered 2 dwarves to extinguish every lantern except those absolutely needed, and darkness swept swiftly across the abandoned garden. The treasure seekers obeyed without protest, their earlier confidence dissolved by the approaching threat. Legolas guided them toward a line of carved pillars overlooking the only entrance into the chamber. "If battle comes," he said quietly, "hold your ground. panic will trap us more quickly than any blade." The men nodded, grateful now for leadership they had not expected to need. Moments later, the first orc appeared in the corridor, carrying a smoking torch. Its armor was pieced together from scavenged iron, and scars crossed its broad face, where older battles had left their mark. Behind it came another, then half a dozen more, advancing cautiously with curved blades already drawn. Their leader sniffed the air like a hunting beast before grinning beneath broken teeth. "Fresh folk," he growled, just as the old tunnels promised. More shadows gathered behind them until the passage seemed alive with moving darkness. Gimli counted quickly. There were nearly 20 orcs pressing into the narrow approach, perhaps more beyond the reach of the torchlight. Too many for comfort, yet too many also to enter the chamber all at once. He looked toward Legolas, whose eyes met his own without a word needing to be spoken. They had fought side by side upon walls, plains, forests, and ruined cities. They both recognized the same advantage at the same instant. The dwarf lifted his axe, its keen edge flashing briefly in the dim light. A slow smile crossed his weathered face, despite the danger before them. "Well, my friend," he murmured, "it seems the mountain has remembered us." Legolas drew the bowstring to his cheek, calm as still water beneath moonlight. "Then let us remind these creatures," he replied, "that some roads are better left unopened." The first orc charged through the doorway with a savage howl, and the hidden garden, silent for thousands of years, echoed once more with the sound of battle. The first orc never reached the center of the chamber. Legolas's arrow struck with the clean certainty that had earned his name among friend and foe alike, and the creature collapsed before its cry had fully left its throat. At the same moment, Gimli surged forward with the strength of a charging ram, his axe sweeping low through the narrow entrance, where the confined passage denied the orcs room to surround him. Iron clashed against iron, sparks burst across the stone floor, and the echo of every blow rolled through the ancient hall like distant thunder. Behind them, the dwarves formed a solid wall of shields, while the treasure seekers, seeing no other hope, drew their swords and stood beside those they had come to deceive. The orc captain snarled and shoved his own warriors aside, forcing his way toward the front with brutal impatience. He was larger than the others, broad across the shoulders, with scraps of black mail hanging from his scarred frame. A heavy cleaver rested in one hand, its edge chipped from years of savage use beneath the mountains. "Take the hall," he roared. "The old master said the white thing still grows below." Gimli heard the words, even as he turned another blade with the haft of his axe, and something colder than battle settled in his thoughts. These orcs had not stumbled upon the refuge by chance. Someone had sent them. The passage became a killing ground. Only 2 orcs could force their way through the doorway at once, and every step forward cost them dearly. Legolas loosed arrow after arrow without haste, choosing each target with calm precision while never wasting a single shaft. Whenever one orc stumbled, another immediately took its place, driven onward by fear of the captain behind them. Gimli fought shoulder to shoulder with 2 veteran dwarves, their axes rising and falling in measured rhythm rather than reckless fury. Stone beneath their boots grew slick with blood, yet neither dwarf yielded so much as a pace. One of the treasure seekers cried out as an orc slipped beneath a swinging axe and slashed his arm. The wounded man staggered backward, but before the creature could finish him, another of his companions stepped between them with desperate courage. Steel rang against the curved orc blade, buying just enough time for a dwarf's hammer to crush the enemy's shoulder. The leader of the men stared in disbelief at the warriors protecting those who had entered as intruders. Shame crossed his face more deeply than fear. Whatever dreams of forgotten riches had led him into the mountain seemed very small beside the steadfast loyalty unfolding before his eyes. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed. At last, the surviving orcs drew back into the corridor, dragging several wounded companions with them. The captain lingered only long enough to glare into the chamber with burning yellow eyes before retreating after his followers. No victory cry followed their withdrawal. Instead, a strange silence settled beyond the entrance, broken only by the fading scrape of boots against stone. Gimli did not pursue. Orcs rarely abandoned a fight without reason. Legolas lowered his bow slightly, listening into the darkness. His keen hearing reached farther than any other in the chamber, and after a long moment, his expression grew troubled. "They are not fleeing," he said quietly. "They are gathering elsewhere." Gimli wiped his axe clean upon a fallen cloak and frowned. "To surround us?" The elf slowly shook his head. "No. They are moving deeper into the refuge." At once, every eye turned toward the unexplored passage beyond the abandoned garden. The realization struck Gimli with sudden force. "The flower," he said. "They know where it lies." He looked toward the treasure seekers, whose leader stepped forward without hesitation. "We owe you a debt," the man said, binding the wounded arm of his companion. "If those creatures seek whatever has been hidden here, then we shall help stop them. Gold no longer concerns us." Gimli studied him briefly before giving a single firm nod. Trust could not be granted lightly, yet battle often revealed a person's true measure more clearly than words ever could. The company wasted no time. Leaving 2 dwarves behind to tend the wounded and guard the garden, the rest hurried along the descending corridor through which the fresh water flowed. The passage narrowed repeatedly before opening again into chambers filled with forgotten craftsmanship. They crossed graceful bridges, carved from a single span of stone, and past walls covered with faded images of flowering trees, mountain peaks, and stars reflected in quiet pools. Though dust lay everywhere, the flowing water remained bright and clear, as if the mountain itself still faithfully carried out an ancient duty. As they descended farther, the fragrance of blossoms strengthened until it seemed impossible that it could come from only memory. The air grew softer, touched by a gentle warmth, unlike the cold caverns above. Even the lantern flames burned more steadily, sheltered from every wandering draft. Legolas paused beside a carved pillar where delicate vines had been sculpted into the stone with astonishing skill. Hidden among the leaves, he found another inscription, nearly erased by time. He read it aloud in the old tongue before translating. "The bloom shall live while water sings, and faithful hands remember their charge." Gimli rested one hand upon the ancient carving. "Faithful hands," he repeated thoughtfully. "Then there were guardians." Legolas nodded. "Not soldiers alone, keepers." His gaze followed the flowing channel disappearing into the darkness ahead. Perhaps the last of them sealed these halls when the shadow grew too great. They entrusted the mountain itself to guard what they could no longer defend in the open. The thought filled the silence between them. Somewhere ahead lay the final purpose of the hidden refuge, preserved through centuries because unknown hands had chosen duty over glory. A faint glow appeared around the next bend, unlike the wavering light of torches. It shimmered softly with a pale silver hue that seemed to rise from the stone itself. The company slowed instinctively, every step measured, every breath restrained. As they rounded the curve, the source revealed itself. Before them stretched a vast cavern, whose ceiling vanished into darkness high above, pierced here and there by slender shafts, through which daylight filtered from cracks in the mountain far overhead. Beneath that gentle light spread a living grove, unlike anything any of them had imagined possible beneath solid rock. Ancient trees with smooth, silver bark rose from rich earth, nourished by countless channels of flowing water. Ferns carpeted the ground, and clusters of white blossoms opened beneath the filtered sunlight, filling the cavern with the sweet fragrance that had guided them since the hidden door first opened. Birds no larger than sparrows fluttered among the branches, descendants perhaps of creatures long forgotten by the world above. In the very center of the grove stood a single flower growing upon a low mound of pale stone. Its 6 white petals shone with quiet radiance, untouched by time, delicate beyond belief, and more beautiful than any bloom either elf or dwarf had ever seen. Yet they were not the first to reach it. Across the grove, emerging from another passage concealed among the rocks, the orc captain and his remaining warriors stepped into the silver light. The captain's cruel smile widened as his gaze fixed upon the solitary flower. Raising his heavy cleaver, he pointed toward the ancient blossom and growled, "Take it!" For the briefest instant, no one moved. The cavern seemed to hold its breath as pale light filtered through hidden cracks high above, falling upon the single white flower at the heart of the grove. The clear streams murmured softly through channels carved by forgotten hands, and the leaves of the silver-barked trees stirred without any wind that could be felt. Then the orc captain barked a savage command, and 3 of his warriors rushed toward the mound with reckless speed, caring nothing for the beauty around them. Gimli raised his axe without hesitation, but Legolas caught his arm for the space of a heartbeat. "Look at the ground," the elf whispered. Only then did Gimli notice what the orcs had ignored. Fine lines had been carved into the pale stone surrounding the flower, forming broad circles that spread outward beneath the moss like ripples upon still water. They were not cracks nor simple decoration, but part of an ancient design carefully hidden beneath centuries of gentle growth. The first orc bounded across the outer ring, laughing as he reached toward the blossom. Before his hand came within a yard of the flower, the stone beneath his feet gave a deep metallic groan. The laughter died instantly. The mountain answered with terrible precision. Massive slabs dropped from hidden recesses high in the cavern walls, striking the ground behind the charging orcs and sealing the nearest escape. Narrow channels burst open beneath the moss as fresh water rushed through them with startling force, spinning ancient wheels buried beneath the floor dot. The carved rings began to glow faintly, not with sorcery that burned or flashed, but with reflected light carried through polished crystal hidden inside the stone itself. Gimli stared in astonishment as mechanisms untouched for thousands of years awakened exactly as their makers had intended. The leading orc tried to leap backward, but the smooth floor shifted beneath him. A broad section of stone tilted sharply, throwing him into a deep pit concealed beneath perfectly fitted slabs. His scream echoed upward before ending with a dull crash far below. The 2 creatures behind him stumbled aside in panic, only to find themselves trapped between rising barriers that divided them from their companions. The orc captain roared with fury and struck one of the stone walls with his cleaver, but the blade merely sparked against rock, harder than forged iron. "Fools," he snarled. "Find another way." Legolas lowered his bow slightly, amazement mingling with respect upon his face. "This was never meant to kill intruders alone," he said. "It was made to protect the flower without harming the grove." His eyes followed the movement of the barriers, which carefully avoided the roots of every tree and diverted the rushing water around each living plant. Gimli watched the flawless balance of craft and purpose unfold before him. No random collapse could have achieved such perfection. Every stone had been placed by builders who valued life above destruction. The treasure seekers looked about them in open disbelief. Their leader slowly sheathed his sword, unable to draw his eyes from the ancient machinery surrounding the flower. "My grandfather believed there was gold beneath these mountains," he said quietly. "He spent half his life searching for it." Gimli glanced toward him while keeping one eye upon the trapped orcs. Perhaps he found something richer than he understood, the dwarf replied. He preserved the map instead of destroying it. Without that, none of us would have reached this place before these creatures. The orc captain was not a patient enemy. Realizing brute force would not open the barriers, he ordered several warriors toward the streams feeding the grove. They splashed through the shallow water with axes raised, hacking wildly at the carved channels in hopes of breaking the ancient mechanism. One struck the stone so fiercely that his weapon shattered near the haft. Another managed to chip a narrow edge, sending water spraying into the air. At once, the gentle hum beneath the floor changed. Somewhere deep below the cavern came the slow grinding of enormous gears, struggling against interrupted flow. Legolas's expression hardened. If they damage the channels, they may starve the flower, he said. There was no fear in his voice, only urgent certainty. Gimli did not wait for further explanation. "With me," he shouted, charging across the nearest safe path, while two dwarves followed close behind. Legolas sprang lightly over the flowing water, loosing arrows as he ran. Each shaft struck cleanly, driving orcs away from the delicate channels before they could inflict greater harm. The grove that had slept peacefully through the long centuries now echoed with battle once more, though every stroke had to be measured lest the defenders themselves destroy what they had come to save. Gimli met the orc captain beside one of the silver trees. Their weapons collided with a crack that rang through the cavern like a smith's hammer striking an anvil. The captain possessed enormous strength, forcing the dwarf backward a pace before Gimli planted both boots firmly against the stone. "Little rat!" the orc growled, swinging again with murderous force. Gimli turned the blow aside and answered with a sweeping cut that bit deeply into the captain's shoulder. Black blood splashed across the roots of the tree, and Gimli immediately shifted his footing so that no further blow would strike the living bark. Nearby, the leader of the treasure seekers found himself facing an orc twice his size. Fear flickered across his face, yet he remembered the dwarves who had shielded him in the garden above. Instead of retreating, he drew the creature away from one of the water channels, trading ground step by step until the orc's attention rested entirely upon him. That brief distraction gave one of Gimli's companions the opening he needed. His hammer descended with crushing force, and the orc fell without another cry. The man breathed heavily, lowering his sword with trembling hands. He had come seeking wealth. He now fought only to preserve something he barely understood. As the struggle continued, Legolas suddenly stopped and looked toward the flower itself. The pale blossom had not closed, despite the violence surrounding it. Instead, its petals seemed brighter than before, reflecting the shafts of daylight falling from the hidden cracks above. Around its stem, the disturbed water gathered into a perfectly clear pool, and beneath its surface, something long concealed began to emerge. At first it appeared to be another stone, smooth and white beneath the water. Then the current washed away centuries of fine silt, revealing carefully carved letters upon its face. "Hold them," Legolas called. "There is a message beneath the flower." Gimli drove the orc captain backward with another powerful stroke, buying only a few precious moments. All around them, the ancient mechanisms continued to shift, sealing passages, raising barriers, and guiding the streams with unwavering purpose. The hidden refuge was revealing its final secret, but only if its defenders could keep the enemy from reaching the white blossom before the mountain finished telling the story entrusted to its care. Gimli forced the orc captain away from the center of the grove with a flurry of heavy blows that echoed from the vaulted ceiling. Every strike drove the creature another step across the smooth stone until his boots slipped in the shallow water flowing between the ancient channels. The captain answered with savage strength, swinging his chipped cleaver in wide arcs that would have split an ordinary warrior from shoulder to hip. Gimli met each attack with disciplined precision instead of reckless force, conserving his strength while denying the orc any path back toward the white flower. Nearby, Legolas continued to send arrows into the confusion with unerring calm, each shaft finding an enemy who ventured too close to the delicate waterways. The hidden machinery beneath the grove continued its patient work. Stone barriers shifted inch by inch, not with violent crashes, but with the measured certainty of devices crafted to endure the ages. Water poured through newly opened channels, filling shallow basins before disappearing beneath polished slabs into unseen depths below. As the current strengthened, the clear pool surrounding the flower widened until it reflected the shafts of daylight like a flawless mirror. The carved stone beneath the water emerged, little by little, every passing moment revealing another line of ancient writing. Legolas crossed the grove in swift silence whenever an opening appeared, never lingering long enough to invite attack. Kneeling beside the pool, he brushed away the remaining layer of fine silt with the tips of his fingers, careful not to disturb the roots of the flower itself. Ancient letters, untouched since the Elder Days, shone pale beneath the water as though they had been carved only yesterday. He read the first lines in the old tongue, speaking softly to himself while translating each phrase within his thoughts. His expression changed from concentration to quiet wonder. "What does it say?" Gimli called without taking his eyes from the orc captain. Legolas looked up only briefly before returning his gaze to the inscription. "It is the account of those who built this refuge," he answered. "They write that during the long wars against the Shadow, when distrust divided many hearts, a company of elven gardeners and dwarven stonewrights chose another path. Together, they preserved the last living shoot of a flower that had once grown in fair lands, now destroyed beyond recovery." He paused, tracing another line beneath the clear water. "They swore that neither people alone would claim it. Its life would belong to both, or to neither." Those words carried across the grove, even above the clash of weapons. The treasure seekers stood listening while defending the narrow approaches, and the weight of the ancient oath settled upon them. Their leader lowered his sword for a brief moment, gazing at the solitary blossom with entirely different eyes. It was no prize to be owned, no relic to be sold to collectors or kings. It was a trust handed forward through thousands of years by hands that had believed friendship could survive where kingdoms often failed. The orc captain heard enough to understand that the flower possessed value beyond ordinary reckoning. With a furious roar, he abandoned his contest with Gimli and hurled himself toward the center of the grove, caring nothing for the mechanisms beneath his feet. Gimli pursued at once, but the creature had already gained several long strides. Legolas loosed an arrow that pierced the captain's thigh, yet the wound only slowed him. Snarling with pain, the orc reached the edge of the pale pool and raised his cleaver high above the flower. Before the blade could fall, the mountain answered once more. The clear water surrounding the blossom vanished downward through hidden channels in a single heartbeat. The polished stone beneath the captain's boots separated into 6 equal sections that folded inward like the petals of a closing flower. The great orc gave one startled cry as the ground disappeared beneath him. Dot his cleaver spun from his grasp, striking harmlessly against the edge of the opening before vanishing into darkness with its master. A deep rumble rolled through the grove as the mechanism completed its motion, and after several long moments, the stone petals closed again so perfectly that scarcely a seam remained. Silence swept across the cavern. The surviving orcs stared in open terror at the place where their captain had stood. Their courage, never founded upon loyalty, broke at last. Some fled toward the passages by which they had entered, only to find ancient barriers still blocking their escape. Others threw down their weapons and tried to scramble over the rocks in blind panic. Gimli and the dwarves pressed forward relentlessly, while Legolas's arrows denied every desperate attempt to regroup. Within minutes, the struggle was over. Those orcs who escaped vanished into forgotten tunnels beneath the mountains, abandoning forever the refuge they had hoped to plunder. For several moments, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of flowing water and the slow settling of hidden stone deep beneath the grove. Gimli planted the head of his axe upon the ground and drew a long breath, his mail stained by battle, but his eyes fixed upon the untouched flower. Not a single petal had been bruised. Around its slender stem, the water quietly returned, filling the pool once more, as though the mountain itself sighed with relief. Legolas knelt beside the inscription and continued reading where he had been interrupted. "There is more," he said softly. "The builders foresaw that one day the shadow would pass from Middle-earth. They believed that when peace finally returned, guardians from both peoples would come together again, not because of command, but because of friendship freely chosen." He smiled faintly as he looked toward Gimli. "They left no prophecy, only hope." Gimli removed his helmet and stood in thoughtful silence. He remembered the long road from Rivendell, the bitter snows of Caradhras, the dark halls of Moria, the battles that had nearly claimed every member of the Fellowship. Never once during those perilous years would he have imagined standing beside an elf in a hidden garden built jointly by their forgotten ancestors. Yet here they stood, not as reluctant allies forced together by war, but as true friends protecting the same living treasure. It seemed that the ancient builders had entrusted their work to the future with remarkable wisdom. Then the leader of the treasure seekers stepped quietly to the edge of the pool. He bowed his head before Gimli and Legolas, his voice humble, where once it had carried eager ambition. "This place should remain hidden," he said. "The map ends with me. I shall burn every copy I possess and speak of these halls to no one who seeks wealth instead of wonder." Gimli regarded the man steadily before extending his hand. The clasp they shared was firm, simple, and without further oath, yet every witness understood that it bound more strongly than parchment or wax seals ever could. Far above them, a narrow shaft admitted one final beam of afternoon sunlight. It fell directly upon the white flower, whose petals glowed with quiet radiance beneath the living stone. Neither elf nor dwarf reached out to touch it. Some treasures were honored best by leaving them exactly where they had endured through the long years, waiting patiently for those worthy enough to protect rather than possess. The battle was over, yet no one hurried to leave the hidden grove. The quiet that settled beneath the mountain was unlike the silence after war, for it carried neither grief nor dread. Clear water continued its endless course through the ancient channels, and the silver-barked trees stood untouched despite the struggle that had raged among their roots. The white flower remained upon its pale stone, its 6 delicate petals opening toward the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the mountain high above. Gimli looked upon it for a long while before finally resting his axe across his shoulder, feeling that he had entered a place where victory was measured, not by enemies defeated, but by what had endured. Legolas finished reading every remaining line carved beneath the clear pool, speaking the oldest passages first in their ancient tongue, before giving them voice in the common speech. The inscription named neither kings nor mighty captains. Instead, it honored ordinary craftsmen whose names had been forgotten by every chronicle that survived into the Fourth Age. dwarven masons, elven gardeners, keepers of springs, stonecutters, seed bearers, and builders who had labored together through dangerous years, were remembered simply as faithful guardians. Their final words were humble. They asked only that whoever discovered the refuge should preserve it for those who came after, just as they themselves had done. Gimli slowly walked around the pool, studying every detail that earlier excitement had hidden from his notice. Small stone plaques rested beneath several of the silver trees, each carved with a single name in either ancient Khuzdul or an elder form of Elvish. No title distinguished one from another. Elf and dwarf alike were commemorated with equal honor, their resting places marked only by living roots and flowing water instead of proud monuments. The dwarf removed his helmet once again and bowed his head in quiet respect. "They built more wisely than many kings," he said. "Their work outlived every fortress raised for war." The leader of the treasure seekers approached the ancient graves with careful steps, his companions following close behind. Their faces still bore the weariness of battle, yet something gentler had replaced the restless hunger that had first brought them beneath the mountain. "We mistook this place completely," the man admitted. "Every tale we inherited spoke of hidden wealth, but the truth was greater than any of them guessed." Gimli regarded him steadily before answering. "Gold invites thieves. Stories change with every telling. Yet now you know what truly lies here, and knowledge carries its own burden." The man nodded without hesitation. "It does, and I will bear it faithfully." Before departing, the company repaired what little harm the battle had caused. Broken stones were lifted from the channels, and damaged edges were fitted back into place beneath Gimli's careful direction. The chipped watercourse mended cleanly beneath skilled dwarven hands, restoring the steady flow that nourished the grove. Legolas gathered scattered branches and gently cleared the soil where hurried footsteps had disturbed the moss. No one touched the flower itself. It needed no tending from those who had merely become its latest protectors. Their return through the hidden halls was slower than their descent. They paused once more in the ancient garden, whose empty beds now seemed less mournful than before. Gimli looked across the dark earth and imagined it alive again, with blossoms tended by patient hands from two peoples who had chosen trust over suspicion. Legolas noticed the same thought upon his friend's face and smiled quietly. "Perhaps the flowers are gone," he said, "but the garden has not truly ended. One living bloom kept its memory until we arrived." Gimli answered with a faint laugh. "A stubborn flower. It has something of a dwarf in it." When they reached the great circular chamber with its 12 stone seats, the company rested briefly before the ancient pillar. Gimli traced the weathered inscription that had first spoken of the covenant between stone and green life. The words carried clearer meaning now than when he had first read them. The hidden refuge had never been a fortress, nor a treasury, nor a sanctuary for frightened exiles alone. It had been a promise made during an age of darkness, preserved not through strength of arms, but through steadfast cooperation. Such promises, he reflected, demanded renewal from every generation. The concealed doorway closed behind them with the same patient grace by which it had opened. Water flowed once more into the hidden basin beneath the floor, and the great slab settled so perfectly into place that its seams vanished from sight. Only Gimli, Legolas, the faithful dwarves, and the humbled treasure seekers now knew the means by which it could be opened again. The carved runes disappeared beneath fresh stone dust, brushed carefully into every crack, leaving no sign for wandering travelers to follow. The mountain resumed its ancient silence, guarding its secret as faithfully as it had for thousands of years. Several days later, beneath the bright autumn sky outside the glittering caves, Legolas prepared for his journey back to Ithilien. The horses waited quietly near the mouth of the deeping coombe, while dwarves carried supplies for the road. Gimli stood beside his friend, without speaking for a time, watching sunlight touch the peaks of the White Mountains. At last, the dwarf broke the silence. Long ago I thought stone and forest could never truly understand one another. Legolas looked toward the distant woods stretching beyond the plains of Rohan, and replied with a gentle smile. Yet beneath a mountain we found a garden that proved otherwise. They clasped forearms, as they had done many times since the War of the Ring ended. No grand speeches passed between them, for years of shared danger had long ago made such words unnecessary. Legolas mounted his horse and turned once more toward the entrance of the glittering caves. "Guard the flower well," he said. Gimli smiled beneath his beard. "It seems to have guarded itself for several ages already. We shall merely make certain that no fool disturbs its rest again." As the elf disappeared along the western road and the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Gimli remained standing before the mountain that had become his home. He thought not of hidden mechanisms or forgotten battles, but of the unnamed craftsmen whose friendship had outlasted empires. Their labor had survived because it was built upon trust rather than pride, and because each generation had passed its duty quietly into the hands of the next. Deep beneath the White Mountains, the last white blossom of an ancient age continued to bloom in peace, unseen by the world, yet never truly forgotten. And so the secret refuge remained hidden, the covenant endured, and the tale of the elven flower passed into the quiet history of Middle-earth, known only to those whose hearts valued guardianship above possession.